Welcome everybody to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. Took a little bit of time off because of the holidays. We'll be taking a little time as a vacation and Thanksgiving coming up. For the most part, we're going to be here on Wednesdays. Hope everybody had a wonderful Rosh Hashanah, spiritual Yom Kippur, and that Sukkot's been going smoothly. Welcome today to David, back from England. So happy to have you back in the States.
Yep, great to be here.
It's great to have you. Welcome to Flossie and to Arlene and to Ron, who is still the disembodied hand, to Larry and Jane and to Eva and to Terry Weintraub, who is masquerading as Karen Blickstein. Good to see you. And thank you also to Karen for doing a beautiful job. We got rave reviews from your Yom Kippur speaking. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Except I'm on the Oseh Shalom Zoom account.
I assume, yes, I knew.
Yeah, but I'm not supposed to be. But all right, I don't know that they need it. So all right.
You want
Sorry.
me to, I can change your name for you if you want me to.
No, I can do that. That I'll do. I will do that. Sorry.
So, and welcome to the plethora of people joining us on YouTube. What we're going to discuss today after the holidays are over, I thought since we're all in the synagogue and so many people come to synagogue or watch online, that we talk a little bit about the history of the synagogue and the rabbinic view of the synagogue. Talmudic view, as we know, the synagogue had already been around by the time of the Midrash, the Mishnah, and the Talmud, so they speak quite a lot about it. We'll talk a little bit about the history and a little bit about how it's looked upon and viewed by the Jewish world. So first, and I apologize, I still have a little bit of my coughing issues, so I'll get a cough drop. We're going to first talk a little bit about the history. So as we know, the center of the Jewish world for a very long time was the temple. Before that, it was the tabernacle. Tabernacle was what they built in the desert, tent of meeting. It was where they placed the Ark of the Covenant as they traveled. When they settled in one place, it was placed one place. It ended up in northern, what is Israel, that ended up being brought into the temple. The temple replaced the tabernacle, which included the Ark of the Covenant. So again, the tabernacle was the giant tent, like a circus tent. And inside the tent, they put several things, including the menorah and the Ark of the Covenant. When they built the temple, they put the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, and the temple replaced the tabernacle. So this we all know. However, we know that for several reasons, what we call now the synagogue was developed. The synagogue is known as Beit HaTfilah, the house of prayer, Beit HaKnesset, house of assembly, and of course Beit HaMidrash, the house of study. Synagogue means come together, bring together. It is a place of assembly in Greek. In Yiddish, shul comes from the German word shul, meaning school. So, and in the modern world, and Savannah is a very good example, these are synonyms, but not always used as synonyms. In Savannah, Mikveh Israel was called the temple, as became popular in the Reform movement. Agudat Achim, the conservative synagogue became known as the synagogue. And BBJ, B'nai B'rith Jacob, the Orthodox synagogue became known as the shul. Yeah. It's not as set in stone today because we use synagogue for Mikveh Israel. We don't use shul, but some people even use it but the history goes back fairly far. We know for sure that were synagogues in the 3rd century BCE. There's not a lot of evidence, but there's definitely some. So we know in the 200s BCE, before the Maccabees, we had synagogues. What were they doing? Because we still at the time had the temple. So we know then that synagogues and the temple overlapped for maybe 300 years, maybe even longer. There's some belief that we have synagogues going all the way back to the destruction of the temple and the Jews being moved to Babylon, and that they may have had synagogues there. There's no real evidence. And certainly there may have been synagogues in the 4th century, in the 5th century in Israel. We just don't have evidence for it, but it's certainly very likely that they probably did. How could they have synagogues at the same time as the temple? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, it's also a house of assembly and meeting, and not everybody lived close to Jerusalem. So you may have wanted to have something in your own community to come together. And that's essential because we're a communal religion. You can't always just go to and if you don't live in Israel, it's even more so. We know that the early synagogues may have been places for pilgrims, for travelers. You'd stay the night, you'd have a dining room, there's a school there. We know that ancient synagogues had the same rules for the structure and that there were no rules. Structures were usually similar to what other things were built, although they might have courtyards. The only thing that all ancient synagogues seem to have had was some sort of platform or section for Torah, some sort of Torah altar. They all had these. We don't know what form they had of the Torah, because it may have been an earlier form different than what we have. They had some sort of Torah altar section. The only other thing all of these ancient synagogues, which we'll talk about, some of them had, was some sort of water structure. Certainly could have been a mikveh, but it wasn't always a mikveh. It could have been some sort of fountain or a basin, or been near next to a body of water, because synagogues could be built anywhere. Some were by bodies of water, some were not, but they all had some sort of water, mikveh, basin, near next to a water fountain, cistern. They had something there. So we know they had something for some sort of Torah altar, even though we don't know what the Torah is. We know they go way back to the 3rd century. The oldest synagogues that we have found archaeologically are from the 2nd century in Delos and Ostia. But we know we have records of them going back to the 3rd century. But the oldest ones we have actual evidence where you can actually go and see it are in the 2nd century. So that would be during the time of the Maccabees, although this was not in Israel. Any questions so far? So we know.
Rabbi,
Yes, Flossie.
when you say we're a communal religion, does that mean we can't so much pray by ourselves? We need a group, to pray?
That's an excellent question. We're going to talk about that in a bit. The answer is yes and no. We are a communal religion from the very beginning. The Bible speaks mostly in the plural, the people. We can, though, pray alone. However, it's preferable to pray together. That's why there are certain prayers where you have to have a certain number of people.
A minyan.
A minyan for some, even for saying things over the prayer after eating, Birkat Hamazon. To do the full thing, you need at least 3 people. Ron.
I have a different question, but it's been happening a lot. Am I the only one where the picture freezes and we lose the rabbi's sound, or is everyone freezing?
The only one, I see you freezing and nobody else right now, sometimes. But the biggest question I have for you, Ron, as the disembodied ham, is Wednesday, which was one of my favorite TV shows. When is your 2nd season coming? I mean, when is, it's from the Addams Family, the Ham. When is your 2nd season coming? But anyway, I digress. So we see.
Well,
Ron?
No, It's freezing again. Hmm.
Sorry, Ron.
Yeah.
You're the only one freezing right now.
Wow.
We know there were synagogues. We know they had places probably for mikvahs or water fountains. We know they had some sort of Torah. We'll talk about some of the specific ones. We know there were used for everything from teaching to meals to fasting together. They were used for judicial proceedings, for weddings, funerals, even public flogging sometimes. So these were houses of study, houses of gathering, and houses of prayer, just like the names say. So we know we had all of these places. Often, as I mentioned, because people couldn't come to Jerusalem because it's far if you lived to go to the temple. Were they sacrificing? At certain periods in history, the sacrifice became more and more centered on the temple. Were some of these places of sacrifice? Most likely. But eventually, of course, they stopped being that. And we're talking about synagogues in quite a few places. In Babylon, in Egypt, in Israel, Dora, Caesarea, Nazareth, Capernaum in Israel, but also in other places. And so they became what we think is fairly popular. If you wanted to be religious and connected outside of Jerusalem, then you had a synagogue. You had a Beit Knesset or a Beit Midrash, or later a synagogue or a shul, depending on when it was founded. We have evidence of them in the Roman Empire quite a bit. In Spain, of course, Budapest and Prague, Gothic ones going out through. They have a wide range of symbols on them. The Star of David certainly is one of them, but the Star of David, as we talked about, was not the symbol of Judaism in ancient times that it is today. It was one of many. One of the most disconcerting symbols was, of course, the swastika. You see it on ancient symbols, not only in Judaism, but in the Hindu religion as well. Obviously, this was very long before the Nazis, who usurped the symbol. So now, one of the other questions we have to think about is, we know the synagogue was started at the same time of the temple. And probably they worked in unison. You know, at your home, but you still go, and eventually they became competitors. So sometime in the first century, the synagogue celebrants and the temple proponents went into competition with each other. Sometimes it was a friendly competition, sometimes it was not so friendly. Eventually, by the 1st century CE, they become known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Even a little before that, the proto-rabbis, basically, and those who support the priesthood. The priesthood, of course, supported the temple, was connected to the Roman Empire. The proto-rabbis, they were not called rabbis at the time. Pharisees wanted to do study and prayer, not in addition to sacrifice, but instead of sacrifice. And that is a major change in our history, going from the sacrificial system. Now, it wasn't like one day we went and did the sacrificing and we stopped doing sacrificing. The temple's destroyed, we stopped doing sacrificing, but it wasn't like the synagogues developed that next day. They had been in the process for hundreds of years, ready for such a moment. And when the temple's destroyed, very soon afterwards, the synagogue structure became the center of the Jewish world. When the priests put all their power into one place and it was destroyed, and for centuries we had said you can only sacrifice in one place, it has to be at the temple in Jerusalem. and the temples destroyed, they were never able to, and a lot of them had been killed, obviously, also. They were never able to say, well, let's evolve and start sacrificing somewhere else. In small groups, they did it. They were still sacrificing in Ethiopia when they found the Ethiopians, the Jews there. So they were never able to replicate this sacrificial system. One of the reasons was it was probably becoming less and less popular. People were less and less interested in sacrificing to a god because they didn't believe it was necessary. And that had probably been a growing view for many generations. So although the power brokers of the temple probably missed it, and everybody was very upset about the temple being destroyed and people dying, of course, everybody was very upset about not being allowed to move to Jerusalem or live in Jerusalem through this new Roman edict. The temple system, I think we have to believe, would have eventually dissipated, and without the Roman support especially. So it was something that was going out of phase anyway, kind of like VHS. The VHS existed at the same time as the DVD, just like the computer and the DVD. The computer, watching on a computer on Netflix online, existed at the same time as the DVD. Just like the cassette existed at the same time as the record, or the 8-track actually died out before the cassette. So actually, probably not. Maybe the 8-track and cassette. But we're talking over hundreds of years instead of a few years. Now, as for the synagogues, a wide range of architecture. Some were famous for having curved windows. As we know, the Ten Commandments was very popular, especially later on, in putting at the front of the synagogue or somewhere else. Eventually, the Aron HaKodesh developed, where Torah scrolls were placed in the middle for the Sephardic synagogues, towards the east, towards the wall facing Israel for Ashkenazic. The Reform synagogues in the 19th century started to change things with the organ and having the rabbis turn around and pray facing everybody else. And the bema, of course, was at the front of the synagogue.
It must be the signal here.
Yeah, it's probably a signal, guys. That's why. Sorry about that. So the synagogue evolved. So the oldest one I mentioned is an old Samaritan one called the Delos Synagogue, the alias of Delos or Delos. The Jericho Synagogue is one we have from the 1st century BCE in Israel. Some of the oldest synagogue fragments, as I mentioned, are from the 3rd century, and those are in Egypt. We know there was already Jewish communities in Egypt going way back. The Herva Synagogue is the oldest synagogue, one of the oldest synagogues in Israel that was in the temple, and it was rebuilt in recent years after being destroyed, I think, in the War for Independence in 48. It may have been destroyed before that. That one goes all the way back to the 1st century. So these are some of the old synagogues as it developed. Some of these synagogues had pictures of human beings on the windows. The edict that you're not allowed to have human beings up hadn't really probably developed yet. Some of them had astrological symbols that were very popular, especially in the Greek synagogues, where, you know, we're not supposed to do astrology, but you see the symbols and mosaics on the floor. You see them in Israel as well. So it shows that we evolved. Never was there officially, unlike the temple, a rule, though, how you build a synagogue that we know of, except that they have Torah altars, they had the mikvahs or water, and then later on, of course, we developed some rituals, the Ark for the Torah, having the menorah facing Jerusalem. So what we know is it was a popular place going way back. And to this day, it is a popular place. And as always, there's always going to be competition for the synagogue or shul for other things. But again, things change as life goes on. We know,
Rabbi,
yes, Flossie.
when did stained glass come into the synagogue?
That is a good question. I think that is more a European
I'm sorry,
tradition.
could you repeat the question? When did what?
When did glass, whatchamacallit, glass?
When did stained
Oh,
glass?
stained glass. Okay, I'm sorry.
That's a good question. I'm pretty sure that comes with it, but we can look that up. I don't know when it started. I'll look that up. Because,
Wanda Smith made us one of the most beautiful.
okay.
Oh, I can-
I've seen, okay.
And I'm looking when years ago.
I've seen things on the current ones that have it and some history, but I don't know where I'll have to look up later. I can't find a origin. I'll have to do a little research of that. All I know is ours is the best ones. That's all I know. Here we go. See if this works. Let's see if this article has any information on the history of stained glass in the synagogue. Then we're going to look at the synagogue. Okay, it says here, so it's got a history of the stained glass article with, and it doesn't have any information.
Want me to look while you're still?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I would say European, definitely mimicking churches. So
Yeah.
I would say no more than 600 or 700 years, but
That's what I'm thinking of.
probably less because a lot of the stained glass came from Italy.
We visited so many old synagogues in Europe. I'm trying to think.
So I'll let you look that up. Now, what we're going to
I'm
do
gonna
is
look,
look at some of the text dealing with the synagogue. So I'm going to go to shared screen and I'm going to look at some text that deal with the synagogue. The first one is not an actual text. It's by a Israeli professor. The use of the temple as a model is prominent with regard to the synagogue. No one knows how synagogue life began. Often it's traced to the phrase Mikdash Me'at, miniature temple. This, of course, is where it's always referenced, the phrase in Ezekiel. This is a homiletic, but not necessarily historical. Understanding the phrase, which makes a direct connection between temple and synagogue. We hear of actual synagogues only in the last centuries before the Common Era. There's evidence of their existence both in the diaspora and the land of Israel. It's difficult to speak of the synagogue for both the physical structures and the activities that took place in them varied widely. In Roman Judea, synagogue seems to have been an all-purpose communal building that was not only or not even necessarily a place of worship. Women may have had active roles in synagogue leadership. It was used for public reading and the study of the Torah and the prophets before it was used for prayer. Public prayer may have become part of the synagogue life only after the temple was destroyed, although there are diverse scholarly views on the matter. And this is an excellent little synopsis. When did prayer start? Boy, that is a debate. We know there are some prayers, very few in the Bible, most notably, of course, the priestly benediction. Prayer as a competition to the sacrifice evolved. So when the synagogue first started, or the Beit HaMidrash, Beit HaKnesset, again, it probably wasn't a competitor to the temple. They worked together. But as prayer started to evolve as a possible substitution or replacement, that's when they became competitors. We don't know exactly when prayer really started to be popular and started to be looked at as this replacement. We know it was cemented after the destruction of the temple, but we don't know what they were praying in the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries. Some would say the Amidah is the oldest prayer in terms of the liturgy, but we don't know really historically when it started. So let's look at some of these thoughts. This is from the Mishnah Torah, of course, from Rambam, Maimonides. Every place that has 10 or more Jews must prepare a house in which they will gather for prayer at all appropriate prayer times. This place is called the House of Gathering, Beit HaKnesset. Townspeople can legally force each other to build a Beit Knesset and buy a Torah scroll. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So what does this tell us? The Beit Knesset we know has been around for a long time, way before Maimonides. But Maimonides says we can legally force each other to build one. That's how important it was. If you have 10 people community, they must be coerced into building a synagogue, even if they don't want one. So it shows how center it became in our world. From the Talmud, from Megillah, which is obviously in the section that discusses the book of Esther, as well as others, but the Talmud goes from one place to the other. It was taught, Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, says, see how beloved the people of Israel are before the Holy One, blessed be He. Wherever they were exiled, God's presence was with them. They went down to Egypt, and God's presence was with them. They were exiled to Babylon, and God's presence was with them. Where in Babylon is God's presence to be found? Abaye says, in the synagogue of Hutzel, and in the synagogue of Shaf-Beyativ and Nehardea. I have been for the people as a lesser sanctuary in the lands in which they arrived, again from Ezekiel. Said Rabbi Isaac, this refers to the synagogues and house of study in Babylon. So, God's presence was with us at all times, but according to the Talmud, at this period, they believe God's presence in synagogues dates back to Babylon, which is, the Talmud is not always a very good historical document, but in this case, it could be right. In terms of, they may have had synagogues, although obviously they wouldn't use the word synagogue, Beit HaKnesset, in Babylon as early as 584 BCE, after the destruction of the temple, the first one. Do we have any evidence of synagogues being in Babylon this far back? We don't. That does not mean they were not there. And again, as with other scholars, as we saw with Professor Goldberg, he's referencing a passage in Ezekiel, the same one. I've been for the people as a lesser sanctuary in the lands in which they arrived. So that is the basis in many cases for the synagogue. Now, how important was the synagogue? We already know that Rambam says you can coerce people to build one. What does the Talmud say about this? Reish Lakish, no less, who was famous for being, he'd been a gladiator before he was a rabbi. Whoever has a synagogue in his town but does not go there in order to pray is considered to be an evil neighbor. So not only are we coerced to build a synagogue, if you don't go, you're evil. It almost feels puritanic in nature. Did they mean it to be this aggressive? I don't know. Probably not. But this is what they wrote. From Rambam again, from the Law of Prayer, again in the Mishnah Torah, a Beit Midrash, house of study, is greater than a Beit Knesset. And the great sages, even though they had many synagogues in the cities, only prayed in the place where they studied Torah, and that is when a community minyan prayed there. Okay, now we're getting to logistics. And the synagogues in the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century, and 1st century, Beit Knesset, Beit Midrash, house of study, house of prayer, house of gathering, were synonymous almost. The synagogue was where you went to pray and you went to study. He is saying here that there are now differences between the house of study and the house of prayer. The house of prayer is more important, but you don't study in the same place you pray. You don't pray in the same place you study. It's become where it could be separate rooms. One room is the sanctuary. The other room is the Beit HaMidrash, the house of study. But in the ancient world, they may have been the same places where you're studying and praying in the same place. Even today, we do some studying in the sanctuary, but the sanctuary is mostly used for praying. And studying is used as we're doing it now, online. The rabbi said you should be studying online. That's how important the Talmud is to us. But it shows that there is a separation between different houses of Judaism.
Problem with anything else except
Now, in the Talmud, we also see our rabbis taught in former times, whoever found a lost article used to proclaim it during the 3 festivals and an additional 7 days after the last festival. After the destruction of the temple, may be speedily rebuilt in our own days, it was enacted that the proclamation should be made in the synagogues and schoolhouses. So, this doesn't seem that important, except for we now see the separation between synagogues and schoolhouses also. And by the way, does anybody see this line here? After the destruction of the temple, may it be speedily rebuilt in our own days. It's ironic that the rabbis would say this because the rabbis at the time of the temple didn't like the temple. It's centuries later, so they're not competing anymore. But the rabbis were the ones who said, proto-rabbis, don't go sacrifice to the temple, come and study and pray instead. And now a couple hundred years later, they're saying, may it speedily rebuilt in our own days. It's kind of it shows when there's no competition how things can change. Any questions or thoughts on the synagogue? I answer all the questions? All right. Larry. And are you on mute or can I not? You don't look like you're on mute, but I can't hear you. Can anybody else hear Larry? Larry, would you try talking and see if we can hear you? We cannot hear you, buddy. I'm going to go off this and see if I can figure out what's wrong.
No, I can't hear him either.
Larry, you might want to check your mic. Yeah, we can't hear you. Go to the bottom left where it says mute. Hit that little arrow thing and it'll start giving you examples for options for your microphone. Sorry about that. No, I did not put Larry on mute, just to let everybody know. I love Larry and want to hear what he says. It just.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, you're okay now.
Yeah, just a quick question. When did they get permission to copy the Torah and bring the Torahs into synagogues?
That is a very good question.
Wow.
And that is a question on a question because there's several levels. We know there were some sort of Torah altars or sections in some of these old synagogues that predate the destruction. We don't know what the Torah was. Now, it seems pretty obvious it's 5 books of Moses, but that's only because we know it. When they use Torah in the ancient world, it doesn't describe the first 5 books for a long time. And so when they say Torah, what does that mean? We don't know. We believe the Torah was probably edited and completed by maybe Ezra in the 5th century. Did everybody have that Torah? We know, or we believe, the Bible was canonized around the year 90 CE. What was the Torah before it got there? Did they just say, we've already had this Torah the whole time? Or did they say, no, we got the Torah, we need to use it? Were there several different options of Torahs? And they said, we're going to use this one? Were there different books? We don't know exactly what the Torah looked like. But after the destruction of the temple, it started to become more and more popular to have the Torah in your sanctuary because we were no longer competing with the temple. It became the focus fairly soon afterwards. So a lot of the synagogues would eventually start having arks to represent the Ark of the Covenant. But I don't think there's a set date.
Do we know? Do we know how the tradition of every synagogue saying the same Torah portion started?
Yeah, we do that. We talked about previously. That we do know. We see that both in the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud. And we talked about how eventually, based upon the holiday of Shmini Atzeret, the rabbis in the Talmudic age started to decided, and we have this Talmudically, to divide it into a portion for each week. In Israel, they divided it into 150-ish, 155, I think. And so in Israel, it took them 3 years to read the whole Torah. In Babylon, it took them 1. And then, of course, they'd have Simchat Torah every year. Eventually, that tradition wins out. So by the 9th century, that tradition pretty much went out, I think, in a lot of places. But yeah, we have actually, the Talmud goes over this discussion. And so we talked about it before, so I'm happy to talk about it any other time.
Yeah,
It's really
Rabbi,
Ron.
isn't it, it takes them 3 years, just like in the Orthodox synagogues, to read the Torah, is because they discuss everything. I think that's one reason.
Well, we're talking about, you're right. It can take you a year to read one passage in the Torah if you look at all the midrash and everything else. We're talking about just reading the Torah on Saturday mornings or during the week. The tradition in Babylon became you read a portion every week. That is the tradition we have today. That is directly based upon the Babylonian Talmud, and the portions we use are probably similar. They may be different, but it's the same system. In Israel, they had a system where you read a little bit of the Torah over 3 years. So their portions were completely different. So they had a 3-year cycle. So think about the first reading will be Genesis for us. That's the first portion. It would be 3 portions, and they would not be called Genesis. I don't know what they were called. I don't know if we have that information. So the Babylonian Talmud obviously was the more important Talmud, because that's what we talk about all the time. So that tradition, as with most traditions in Babylon, won out. But as we mentioned also, Larry, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, in the Reform movement, we do it triennially, right?
No, the Reform movement does not. The Reform movement allows each person to choose what they're going to read that week. So we choose what we're going to read
So
from the portion.
Each congregation can choose whether they whether they want to do triennial or annual.
Or we just read like 10 verses, but we choose. That's how we do it.
Oh.
The conservative movement does a triennial.
Triennial.
Yeah, which we talked about, and it's really an interesting. I'll give a synopsis again. The conservative movement is a halachic movement. It is based on the law completely. So the law says very clearly, you read the whole portion over 1 year. That's what it says. Talmud says, in 1 year, you read the entire Torah, a portion each week. And so the question is, how can the conservative movement, which is a halachic movement based on the law, say, no, we're going to do a triannual reading? And the answer is what we just talked about. Because if you're a law-based, sometimes the majority view in 1 century, 300 years later, may be the minority view. So they didn't just make up the triennial cycle. They said, listen, in Israel, 1,700 years ago, they had a triennial cycle. This is law. We can base it on this. So they based their triennial cycle, although their triennial cycle is different, but they based the idea of a triennial cycle. I'm going to put some people on mute. I hear some background noise. So they based the idea of a triennial cycle on the Jerusalem Talmud and what they were doing in Israel. It's very different, though, and I'll try to explain the difference. In ancient Israel, they had 155 portions. Let's say 150, so it's easier. Today we have 50 portions. So The conservative movement also has 50 portions, just like everybody else. Except one year, they divide each portion into 3, A, B, and C. So this year, for instance, they will read A. They'll read the first third of every portion for the year. And then the next year, they'll read the middle portion. And then the third year, they'll read the third. They're still staying with the same Torah portions like everybody else, but they're just reading a third. Whereas in ancient Israel, they actually had 150 Torah portions. But the law is still there that they used a triennial cycle. So the scholars in the conservative movement said they use a triennial cycle. Obviously, they do this with much more content than what I'm saying, but they use a triennial cycle, so can we.
Rabbi?
Yeah, and not all conservative, by the way, not all conservative congregations use the triennial cycle. Some use the whole thing. Jane and then Flossie.
If everybody chooses, I know that I don't think, well, I don't know. Does Mikveh Israel daven 3 times a week together?
No, we do not. So you can
How does
daven.
that work?
I'm sorry, Jen, I interrupted you. I apologize.
So how does that work with the Torah reading?
Excellent question. So traditionally, a Jewish person prays 3 times a day, 4 times on the Sabbath. You read Torah on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday in the synagogue. These are things you should do, but it doesn't mean everybody does them. The synagogue is not, Mikveh Israel doesn't say you cannot pray 3 times a day during the week or 4 times on Saturday. We're saying pray as much as you want. We're going to have communal services on Friday nights, Saturday mornings, and on holidays. Everybody's welcome to join us. Other synagogues say we're going to have a communal service at every time. That is very hard to do because you have to have enough people to come every morning, every afternoon for services. And some synagogues can do it and some cannot. We don't have, I think, the numbers to do it. BBJ, the Orthodox synagogue, does do it, but of course, in BBJ, their whole world is centered just on the synagogue. That's the whole world. That's all they do. That's their life. They don't have all the stuff. They don't volunteer. We're going to move it. You know, their whole life is the synagogue. So they're having 3 services a day because they're always, that's their job. That's their life. They have a different life than we do. AA, the conservative synagogue, also does that, but they have trouble. They don't do it all the time now because it's hard to get a minyan all the time. So everybody does it their own way. But again, you can pray by yourself 3 times a day and 4 times on just the Sabbath. You're allowed to do that. There's a few prayers you can't say, but very few. You don't do Baruch Hu, Kaddish, any refrains, the Kedusha and Mi Chamocha maybe. You don't read Torah, but you can study Torah. So you can pray by yourself wherever you want, but Judaism prefers you pray with others. All right, any other questions? Man, you guys got good questions. Flossie, and you are on mute, by the way. Vaughn, would you just take Flossie off mute, if that's okay? I can help a little bit. So weird, I can ask to unmute, but I can't unmute. There you go.
Okay, thank you. 2 quick questions. For Yom Kippur, we pick Mikveh Israel. We pick the parashah that we want
No, for Yom Kippur, we use the set.
to read.
Yeah.
Are shuls throughout the world reading the same one, or
Yes, they are. All the
is there a
Ashkenazic
particular?
all the Ashkenazic ones are reading the similar ones. Yeah.
Okay,
And
so
the
more,
generally too.
okay.
Sephardic and Ashkenazic are pretty similar. There's some slight changes, but generally they follow the same portions.
Why is the one for Yom Kippur chosen, that particular one? Why did I choose that?
Again, there's a lot of reasons. I mean,
Ex
Probably
Jonah,
because of the
isn't it?
power. It's a Atem Nitzavim Kulchem. You all stand here today for God, the people who are here and the people who are not here. It is a very powerful portion, and that's why it's chosen. It's all about the community coming together, everybody. Souls of the future, souls of the past, people who can be here, people who are physically unable to be here, who live at this time. Everybody comes together, and that's probably why it's chosen. As time goes on, and the rabbis start to take control of the religion, Yom Kippur starts to become more important, especially because Sukkot is all about rain. So if you're living in Babylon, you don't care about, I mean, you care, but the rain in Israel does not determine your lifestyle. Also, Sukkot, Passover, which were probably the two most popular holidays in ancient society, are centered on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And obviously the rabbis do not, especially after the destruction of the temple, and we can't go to Jerusalem, especially that they were competing with the temple in the first place, especially since they're living in Babylon as well, don't want to center a holiday on pilgrimage to Jerusalem because you can't do it. Physically and even legally in some ages because of the Roman Empire. So Yom Kippur starts to ascend in importance over the centuries. And this may be why they chose such a powerful, you're all here together in case of souls, but we're also talking literally because it's a time more people come to synagogue than any time else.
Why
Flossie, sorry.
why is the number 10 used for minyan? And
Hmm.
if there aren't 10, can you still have, like, if there are 8?
If you're 8, and we'll talk about this also second from the Reform perspective, traditionally 8 people can pray together. 1 person can pray. There's a couple of prayers, just a few that you need 10 people. Most prayers you don't need them. Baruch Hu, Kedusha in the morning, and Kaddish are the most well-known ones. You can't read Torah. You can read Torah, discuss Torah. You can't, read it unless you're supposed to have a minyan. But you can pray with. Now, as to why 10 was chosen, I think obvious. It's all pretty obvious. 10 commandments, 10 plagues. 10 is a very succinct number. It's a lot of people, but it's not too many. It's how many we have on our hands. It's a number that is so popular. It's a top 10 list for David Letterman. They obviously took this from probably the 10 commandments. Now, how did they get 10 in ancient, how they get to 10 commandments and 10 plagues? Was 10 the natural number it is for us today as it was in ancient society? It sounds like it probably was. So this is how they chose. A minyan means you have to have a certain amount of people, but you can't make it too large. If you make it 100, then you'll never be able to say the prayers in some places. If you make it 3, it's a very small number, and perhaps the 3 people don't like each other. I mean, it's about having at least some people together.
Okay, thank you.
Rabbi?
Question, Larry.
I know we're diverging here. If you don't mind, another question on the Torah portion for the high holidays. I'm always surprised when we read the portion about God saving Hagar.
Yeah.
And the emphasis on "I will make you a great nation." It just seems, in these bitter times, why was that chosen?
Now, this is a good question. We don't know exactly why. There's some, explanations. I think often, more than not, Judaism tries to stress the difficult moments. How do we handle stress? How do we handle things going wrong? What do we do when we're having the worst day of our life? And it wants us to struggle with these questions as opposed to giving us heroic moments. We don't have a lot of heroic moments. We have more moments about what are the issues they face. And this is a serious issue. They're kicking this woman out of the house. She has not done anything wrong. I mean, she's obviously, her and Sarah don't get along. There's some antagonism. The antagonistic nature. Sarah's very worried, obviously, because she has a son now. Whereas she gave Hagar as a handmaiden, so her son would be legally Sarah's or whatever. Now that Sarah has an actual son, what's the problem? The problem is Abraham has an older son with somebody else. And tradition dictates that the older son, not our tradition, but legalistic tradition in ancient society, the oldest son gets everything or gets the more stuff. So it's a very problematic passage that they're getting rid of this person. They want to show, one, that God still protects this person, two, the difficulty that Abraham is going, and I think that's why. I think it brings questions, debate to the forefront. How are we going to act in an impossible situation where there is no right answer? If Hagar is not kicked out, her son may be the leader, and he is not the one that Abraham or Sarah wants. He'll have a legal right to the throne, even though Abraham's not a king. So, but on the other hand, he didn't really seemingly do anything wrong. So this, I think that's why now, am I right or wrong? Yes, I'm obviously right, because, I am the keeper of Jewish tradition. So obviously, but that's a good question. We don't know exactly why. Yom Kippur is a lot easier because, again, you have this big statement about coming together before God, in the mountain. But
the Torah even goes a little further, though, in that he says, "I will make you a great nation."
Right.
In other words, so are there two great nations now? That is God willing to, and of course, the Muslim religion resides over, Abraham faith and some Jewish customs as well. But did he intend to have two?
Well, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was my question.
I think there's an intention that there's many options. That when it says we are a great nation, it is not you. We are the only great nation. I think it has a lot to do with other people have opportunities to make good decisions and to help Abraham understand that his other son will go on to do great things. In the Muslim world, they take this as their ancestor, but of course, Muhammad doesn't come till the 6th century CE, so it's going to be a full, 1800, 19, probably thousands of years later. But yeah, that's a good question. We don't know. I mean, again, it's a difficult question. It brings up the idea that maybe you're not the only great nation. I think it brings up the idea that you are a great nation, but don't get too full of yourself. You have to stay on target. Also, don't think you're always better than somebody else, because you're not. Even if you have a better relationship with God, you may not be better people. And I think that's an important part to it as well. But both portions for Rosh Hashanah, obviously, we also read the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So that's also a big issue. So both of these play off each other very well because they're very traumatic moments in their life. And funny enough, we talk about Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael and Hagar, but really it centers a lot on Sarah as well. I mean, she's the mother. The special relationship between the mother and the Jewish boy, that goes on forever, right? So, but yeah, I think those are all good questions. And again, one of the reasons I think these two portions are tough is just because they breed questions and discussions. Flossy again.
After the destruction of the first temple, how much time elapsed before the second temple, and did they always feel they would build a second temple, or that developed over the years?
No, what happened was the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586. The Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians, I don't know the exact date where that would happen, 540s, 550s. And the Persian leader, Cyrus, said to all the peoples, including the Jews, if you want to go back home, great. We'll help you build your temple, pay your taxes, don't revolt, and we'll give you some sort of autonomy. And so the Jewish community, some Jews, probably the adventurers, the ones who are not doing as well, not the most successful, come back to Israel 50 years later, 536, and then prophets come and teach of how they build a synagogue, a temple around 516 BCE. But it's small, and they're not as dedicated as probably they should be for another 60 years until Ezra and Nehemiah come and really try and get Judaism back on track.
Rabbi, I just wanted to make a comment.
Larry.
I wanted to make a comment about the stained glass. I work in stained glass, so I did a little history of it a couple of years
Oh,
ago.
great, because I do not.
Yeah, the main idea behind stained glass came about with the change in architecture. And when Gothic architecture came about, it freed up actually the walls, because now you can have an arch that was supporting the type where you needed all of the pillars. If you went into the Parthenon in Greece, you would see, maybe the structure could be supported within 10 feet or something like that. Then you needed all of these pillars. Now with the Gothic arches, you could support large structures without having a lot of internal pillars, as we see in our synagogue. So it was really the Gothic architecture. But the stained glass came about for two reasons, as I recall. One of them was that it told in pictures on the walls now things that people could not read. So that was one of the main ideas in the Catholic Church. And the bishop at Saint Denis in Paris, he was the first one to introduce what he called the holy light. And he said that there's a spiritual light that is coming in through the glass windows that are now opened up that tell these stories. And he thinks that was kind of a large impetus behind putting stained glass behind, the storytelling, and just the fact that you can be bathed in this kind of a spiritual light in the synagogue, not synagogue, but in the churches. And then, of course, when Jewish architects were not permitted, they copied, whatever architect was prominent in that town. They built them along the Gothic lines to free up the interior space of the synagogues.
I think it's very interesting, and sounds like, again, the only difference for us is the Jewish community would have been literate. And so we didn't, another reason we probably didn't need people up there. It was more just symbols.
The type of images that we were permitted. There's a storytelling of Christ, basically, on their images, or the Old Testament as well. They were permitted to put the Old Testament on the walls.
Yeah, that edict did not, obviously did not. And what we'll do is, this is all really, we can continue this topic next week if people want. First thing we're going to do is I'm going to conclude, and then we'll talk about topics. This is the response of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Whereas the general rule is to require a minyan, there was a practice in Palestine in older times to be satisfied with 6 or 7 people. While every attempt should be made to have a full minyan, the importance of regular service in the temple is such as to conduct them even when there are fewer than 10 people present, in accordance with the above-mentioned Palestinian customs. So Reformist movement went back to an older age and said they didn't always have minyans when they were praying. So if they didn't back then, we can. So often we will say prayers even if we don't have a minyan that require a minyan traditionally. So first off, before we conclude, does anybody have anything they want me to pick, to choose to study in the next couple of weeks? Any ideas? If not, I'll just pick some different things. But if you do, and if you don't have it now, just email me. We will have class next week, and then we won't have it on the 6th because I'm out of town. So we will have it next week. And again, tonight is Simchat Torah. This weekend we have the Just, where we'll talk about some of the social justice. We have, I can't remember, the most extraordinary people are sponsoring lunch this weekend. I can't remember who they were.
Oh my goodness!
I truly.
But do you remember why?
I think it's a birthday.
Yes.
And so, but I don't remember their names. So please come for celebrating Karen Stewart and Karen's birthday.
Yes.
And we're also going to have our Just, where we'll talk about social justice. The week after, we're going to have the big event for our docents. So anybody who is a docent or likes to celebrate docents,
if
That's
you,
gonna be on
if
the
you, if you
2nd.
read Bob Greenberg's emails, he'll tell you who's sponsoring.
Did they,
I was joking, Ron. This weekend, Karen Blickstein is sponsoring.
with this, well, Stuart and I, yeah.
I mean,
It's,
Karen.
Ron, it's my 80th birthday Saturday, so that's why.
Sorry,
Oh.
I should have been more direct. So we're so pleased. And then Ron and of course Arlene will be sponsoring our lunch, if we bring that up, for our November 9th
Oh, good.
service.
On
'Cause
the
I-
9th for Veterans Day.
Veterans.
Oh, nice. Very good. Because I noticed there were a lot of openings in,
There's always,
November.
I mean, we try and cover as many as possible.
Okay. Okay.
You're having
So,
Yisker tomorrow, Rabbi, is that right?
One more time.
You're having Yisker tomorrow?
And we have Yisker tomorrow morning. Yes, thank
Okay.
you. For finding 11
Okay.
o'clock. So Veterans Day this year is on the 11th. So we will be doing our veteran service on the 9th.
Good.
So lots going on. And don't forget to volunteer the food festival coming up in just a couple weeks. Stay safe, everybody.
And don't, yeah.
Karen, sorry.
I just want to remind everyone, early voting started in South Carolina this week. Stuart and I voted yesterday.
Please
Very
vote. I
excited.
voted yesterday as well. So
Greg,
everybody
we're,
votes.
we're going right after the session.
All right,
Good.
great. And if you guys really want to vote in Georgia.
I wish I could. Oh my God, I wish I could. I'll say no more about that, but
Give me a call and I'll fix that.
yeah, okay. Well,
Georgia's-
I wish I thought of it
Georgia's a
sooner,
swing
Rabbi.
state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stay safe, everybody.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.